Thank you, everyone, from wherever you may be calling today to join our webinar on Reassuring the Employee Engagement Skeptics, back pocket answers to respond and address concerns about your survey initiative. My name is Louis Mosca, the Director of Sales for the Eastern Region for TalentMap in Canada, and I'll be hosting today's webinar, and our speaker for today's topic will be Norm Baillie-David. He's our SVP of Engagement at TalentMap, and some agenda items here just quickly. We'll spend 5 minutes on the introduction, why the topic, 10 minutes on convincing the finance guy, the business case, 10 minutes on convincing scared employees, the confidential security, convincing employees. We will act on the survey, another 10 minutes, 5 minutes on convincing the CEO, and then 10 minutes Q&A. So roughly about 50 minutes in total is what we've got TalentMap by the numbers. So we've been in business roughly 15 plus years. We've done thousands of engagement surveys since inception, 7,000 plus there as you can see right now on the screen. We do thousands of employee surveys annually, and we do about 500 plus employee engagements annually. So our only focus is employee insights, employee engagement. That's our primary and just some information on some sample clients that we have in our benchmark. So just moving from left to right here. So we're behind some of the awards programs like the Employee Choice Awards, Canada's top Best 100 Employer program, as well as some clients that you may see here, BlackBerry, Stantec, Thales, in the technology area, nonprofit organizations such as the Canadian Red Cross and Federation of Canadian Municipalities. We do a lot of work in the healthcare sector with Sick Kids, Unison, Alberta Health Services, to name a few. You can see some of the financial services companies we've been working with, London Life, Standard Life, Investors Group, Great West Life, as you can see. And lastly, some other organizations such as Sobeys, Canadian Tire, Bayer, just to name a few. So now, having said that, what I'm going to do is I will let Norm take on the topic from here, and we'll touch base thereafter. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Louis. Good afternoon, everybody, wherever in this continent you might be, whatever time zone. Good morning to those of you in Central or West. Why talk about some of the trouble with convincing folks about an employee engagement survey? It basically happens, I would say, several times a week that I get a call, or one of my colleagues gets a call from either an HR professional or sometimes somebody, a senior leadership individual, who knows instinctively that doing an engagement survey in the organization is a good thing to do, and they're convinced for all the reasons that we're going to go through. However, they have trouble convincing their colleagues, they have trouble convincing their leadership teams. Most importantly, they have trouble convincing their own employees of the need to do this. And of course, there's a lot of barriers that get put up. So what I want to do over the next 30 to 40 minutes or so is walk you through some of the most common objections that we get. And this isn't essentially, I want to make something really crystal clear. This isn't essentially TalentMap trying to say, what are the objections to our selling an employee engagement survey. As a matter of fact, most of you, I think, are already clients if my read of the registration list is okay. This is about what do we do before we even contact the vendor, or even before we even decide we want to use an internal provider, or to do it ourselves for that matter. What we're talking about here is just convincing the organization that employee engagement is a good thing to do. So essentially, I want to sort of tackle it, piece by piece, or some of the different audiences and some of the objections that they're going to put up with, and the ones, of course, that we hear the most often. Well, let's start with the finance guy or the finance lady. So, of course, when you want to do an engagement survey, whether it's done in-house or whether you get a provider to do it, there's always a little bit of resources involved. And, of course, you got to convince that finance guy or lady to apportion those resources accordingly and to provide for them in the budget. In some cases, as an HR professional, you might have that budget already. However, you're going to be scrutinized in terms of using some of that budget, even if it's a very modest amount, in terms of conducting one of these employee engagement surveys. And of course, the business case goes beyond finance. The business case goes to leadership. The business case goes to the CEO. But what we have to understand is we have to get through the left brain first. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about left brain, right brain. So we need to address the rational objections about why do we need to do this? Why is it good for the business? Why, once we measure employee engagement and we get happier employees, how is that going to help our bottom line? So essentially, there's no shortage. The business case is extremely strong. And I'm hoping what you'll do is when you get access to this presentation, I'll tell you how that's going to happen at the end, you'll have these back pocket answers ready for the skeptics in your organization that say, it's nice to treat employees well, but when push comes to shove, we have to think about the business. Well, we are thinking about the business. And there's a very, very clear link, a clear empirical link. Some of you who are our clients and some of you who have seen our presentations before will recognize this particular slide. But I want to take you through it again, so bear with me, because it really shows that we can connect the dots between employee engagement and business results. And there's no doubt about this. This is extremely well researched. And of course, as part of this package, I'll provide a lot of the studies that back that up that have been done over the past 10 or 15 years. But essentially, when we look at employee engagement, we see on the screen, we see a number of dimensions, as we call them, that influence engagement. And those dimensions, if we do the right things right on those things, then more and more of our employees are going to feel the things that we see in the second column. They'll be proud, they'll be optimistic, they'll be resilient, they'll be committed, etc. And that's good. And you know what? You can make a case to stop right there, because the employee, the workplace is a better place to be if we stopped right there. But engaged employees, once they feel this way, once they feel proud and optimistic and committed about the organization, they don't stop there. They engage in a series of behaviors that characterize them as engaged employees. We call it discretionary effort, but essentially you can think about it as going the extra mile. It's somebody because they want to, not because they have to. They do go the extra mile. They're collaborative. They take initiative. They're helpful. And when you have a critical mass of employees in your organization doing this, now in my experience, that critical mass really comes to a head. It's really noticeable around between 75 and 80%. And when more than 8 and 10 of your employees, and that includes managers, by the way, are all feeling this way and doing these things, then we see those business results. We see, and I start to list them in the right-hand column, but the studies show, and I've got the link there in case you want to go check those out. But I mean, if you look at the empirical research in terms of the benefits of having a higher level of employee engagement, when you see the difference between those who have top quartile, and top quartile for us is a bit less than 80%. Top quartile would probably be in the low 70s, maybe 75, and bottom quartile would probably be 50% or less. So just in case you're wondering as to what that means. But look at that. I mean, lower absenteeism, lower turnover in both high and lower turnover and low turnover organizations, less shrinkage, or essentially people are in retail organizations are looking more diligently at their product inventory. It's a safer place to be in the healthcare system. There's fewer patient safety incidents. There's, quality is better, customer experience is better, productivity is higher, profitability is higher. I can keep going. There's also links in terms of stock share price for publicly traded companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's no doubt about the business case. And these metrics have been proven over time in numerous empirical studies. So if somebody says there's, come at with me with a business case, you bring them this slide, you have the sources, you're done. That's not what the issue is. The business case is very, very clear. It's all of the underlying more psychological or human issues that we need to confront more directly, and that's where I want to spend most of the time during this presentation. So the first one is the confidentiality. Your employees are going to express concerns about whether or not, if we expose ourselves in an employee survey and say what we think, then is there going to be somebody who reads that, and is there going to be retribution? Is there going to be revenge? Is there going to be some kickback or feedback? And am I going to have basically what we affectionately refer to as CLM, a career-limiting move, by having expressed myself openly in an employee engagement survey? So how do we combat or address those very valid concerns about confidentiality and security of information too? We shouldn't forget the IT component of this, because the IT and the privacy side around privacy on the internet is becoming an increasing concern, not just obviously in the employee survey business, but across the economy. So the stock answer, you've seen this before, probably if you've heard our presentations before. The stock answer is obviously TalentMap or any other reputable survey provider for that matter is going to put some protections in place. So there's going to be no revealing of any individual information. For the industry standard is 5 respondents, but often we are asked by our clients to increase that to as many as 10 or 15 or even 20. Although when we're getting to those size groups, it has to be a very large organization, otherwise it becomes way too limiting. So we're protecting individual confidentiality and anonymity simply by aggregation. So we're grouping all the results are presented in groups. So that's the basic stock answer that of course we all have. You should expect that. You can relay that to employees, but that alone is not going to concern or assuage some of their fears. So let's talk about the IT guy, for example, or IT lady. What do we need to do to address them? Well, first of all, in terms of you're going to have questions about, well, anybody can have access to my data. And this is a particular issue that we hear about in organizations who have done internal employee surveys over a few years, and then have come to realize that there's fewer or lower and lower participation in those surveys. And that's because they simply don't trust their own people, whether it's their HR people or IT people, because they know that if it's internal, that the data resides on their internal servers. It's there for anybody with access to go and look at. So when you're dealing with a third-party provider, such as TalentMap or others, the data resides on our servers, on the provider server. At least it should. And because it does, then of course it's protected by our own security and our own firewalls. There's also an inability to trace to individual workstations. So when someone clicks on a link and provides their data, we don't have access to their workstation from the external point of view. We can only trace it back to the organization's IP address. Then there's an issue around passwords. Oftentimes the way we, for efficiency's sake, marry up HRIS data or demographic data that the organization already has on the individual, such as their age, their years of service, their position, their title, etc., is through, we need to link that up through a unique identifier or a password. But those passwords are destroyed as soon as somebody clicks submit. And we get a lot of blowback on this one, because when we start to indicate that through a survey you're going to be provided a password to access the survey, they're going to say, well, you can trace me through that password. Well, the password is destroyed as soon as somebody does click submit, and now there's no unique identifier information. And then the key here is we've been talking about sort of the survey data, but I'm going to go into what happens with the comments. And this is really where not only employees themselves can trip up, but organizations and even individual survey providers can trip up if not being careful. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to warn people right from the get-go, and they would be warned right from the get-go, that anything that they comment on, although there's no name attached to them, they can be read by various groups, because if we don't read the comments, if nobody read the comments, they'd be of no use. So we need to provide at least limited access to the comments so somebody can gain that insight from the comments. But because they're being read by somebody else, you need to essentially ensure that they don't reveal specific individuals or situations. So that warning is put up front, and we obviously, when you're talking to your employee groups, you can talk about that warning. Unfortunately, that warning is not often enough, so we have to take extra measures, and we do take extra measures, and you can tell your employees that we take extra measures, precisely about verbatim comment. So some of the dilemmas, some of the issues that we addressed. First of all, I spoke briefly just a second ago in terms of the dilemma about sharing the comment. If we kept the comments under lock and key and provided no access whatsoever, well, then there's a ton of insight that's lost. So we need to strike a balance. It essentially is a tightrope walk in terms of how far to share the comments. And our rule of thumb, and this is something that you can discuss with your own employees, our rule of thumb is to provide comments in sufficient numbers, so where the groups are large enough. Now, this far exceeds 5. We're talking hundreds now, with groups so at senior leadership levels whose numbers or whose groups, have at least 30, 40, maybe 100 or more people. So you essentially, the anonymity gets buried in the numbers. So there is some sharing going on. And of course, this is negotiated and dealt with on a case-by-case basis. Every organization makes their own call as to whether or not they want to share the comments. So that being said, those protections, you can tell your employees that they do exist. However, you also have to talk to your employees in terms of they have to take some responsibility for their own anonymity. And we get many, many organizations, actually pretty much every survey we do, we have the prolific employee commenter, someone who's basically going to recount when they have the opportunity to do so, a very, very specific situation with proper names that very, very clearly identifies that individual to someone else who's reading it, who knows them, or may not even know them, may have heard of them. So in that particular case, there's no way, there's no text analytics, there's no software, and even the external third party, if for example, I or my team are reading these comments, we can't necessarily judge those nuances. So the prolific commenter can out themselves if they're not careful in terms of how they provide those comments. And that's why I said that proactive warning needs to be upfront, and you also need to tell them that. That being said, there is still that risk if they're too prolific in their comments that someone might be able to identify that particular situation. And of course, use of proper names is gonna help anybody identify them. Now, there's also one issue there in terms of the prolific commenters. Some of them are not intending to reveal themselves, but many are. Many want to be identified in the comments. Now, from an external third party, or if you're an HR person, even if it's very, very clear that that one person wants to be or doesn't mind being identified, do we identify them, or do we allow that to happen? And the answer is absolutely not. We will not do that. So we will still, if we see that's the case, we'll strike the comment if we can see it. But again, there is some responsibility to the individual commenter. The question on the slide, does the witch hunt still exist? And the unfortunate truth is, I have not seen an organization where yet where it doesn't exist. And what I mean by the witch hunt is essentially the natural tendency, even of the most well-meaning people, well-meaning leadership, well-meaning managers, to, when they see a comment, to try to identify its source or origination. We all instinctively want to do that. We want to identify an individual with what they're saying. So I have referred to it as a witch hunt. It's only a witch hunt if it's nefarious, and sometimes it is. So we have to guard against that, and we do guard against that using all of the protections that I've been talking about now. So you can have this discussion with, and a transparent discussion with your employees in terms of comments, and it's that transparent discussion before the survey takes place that is the best road to assuaging the fears around confidentiality. Now, another issue is starting to arise here, and that that is, there's an increasing trend in the engagement industry, if you will, around what we call open feedback. Actually, it's coming from those who are antithetical or opposed to the concept of the anonymous survey, and are driving towards organizations in which open feedback and open conversation is the goal, and the anonymous survey, the anonymous tool, they view as a threat to that. Not only a threat, but they view as an anachronism, something that's old and tired and should be avoided. And you know what? In a utopic environment, in a very, very, very healthy organization that even in our most engaged organizations I haven't seen yet, that openness, that willingness to provide open feedback even to one's immediate supervisor, unfortunately, in my personal experience and in the experience of many of my colleagues who do this, unfortunately, it's still naive. And it's naive because what we fail to take into account is the power structure that's evident through the issue of compensation. So if someone is, holds the threat of my livelihood or my livelihood in their power, it's very, very clear that I'm not going to provide, that open, honest feedback all of the time. Because, even if, in some cases you will have some relationships where that's happening, and that's possible. But in an organization-wide context, to institute that as policy, unfortunately, I haven't seen the organization yet, even in the most engaged of our organizations, where that level of openness has been attained. It's still utopia. So, keep in mind when you're starting to see more, and you will hear more and more about the open feedback concept, and you'll hear more and more about, why anonymous surveys are bad, and you're going to avoid accountability and all that kind of thing. We need to know what people really think, and they need to put their names on their comments, et cetera, et cetera. Well, unfortunately, I think that's still a bit naive. We're still a ways off from that type of utopia. A couple of other questions. The pins I've addressed. The demographics. The demographics are an interesting one, because this is where you find a lot of crazy behavior going on. So in most cases, the way surveys are handled these days, as you know, are we marry up existing information, profile information on employees with their survey responses through that PIN that we're talking about, or unique identifier. And that is for two reasons. The first reason is to shorten the questionnaire so somebody doesn't have to actually physically answer, how old they are and how many years they've been with the company and things like that. So you can shave a couple of minutes off the survey if they don't have to answer that. But the other issue is when a lot of folks are going to basically assume that if there's profile information in the survey, that by what we call nesting or filtering those different profile questions, that we can figure out who's saying what. And the answer to that is essentially, well, first of all, we avoid that by not asking the questions. And the second part of that is we know that's a legitimate fear even when we do the employee survey, because we get roughly, when we do ask demographics or profile information, we can count on 5 to 10% of employees falsifying their answers, or at least that we catch falsifying their answers. And not on the survey itself, but on the demographic or profile information. And the way we know that happens is in the size of various departments, where all of a sudden you have more people in the finance department than actually work there. So that's going on. Basically, it's a signal that, that they don't necessarily trust the system. But what you can do is anticipate that in terms of your preparation of employees and your assuaging of their concerns or fears, by basically saying that essentially, that's not going to happen. There's so many individuals essentially that, and we take the same precautions for all managers before we diffuse, and I say we, but I'm referring to any survey provider, any reputable survey provider, that we take the previously mentioned precautions so that somebody can't do that. And even in the reporting portals that exist out there, there's protections that are built in, and you can even have your employees try some of those to see that they're not going to be able to drill down, and they're not going to be able to filter based on those profile variables down to a number that's going to be able to identify them as individuals. For example, in our own portal, what happens if somebody tries to do something like that, essentially saying, okay, I want to find the person with 5 years of service or less, who's 25 years old, who has blonde hair, blue eyes, etc. Well, at a certain point, whatever that threshold we set, our portal will basically kick that back and say insufficient sample size. So you can't do that. And that's essentially that protection that you can inform employees about. So that's essentially talking about confidentiality and security. However, the confidentiality and the security, we can assuage those things. The key here, and probably the most important barrier to convincing employees to complete a survey, is the skepticism that you're actually going to act on the survey. And of course, if I look at our top 5 reasons for not responding to an engagement survey, so a little bit of David Letterman, abbreviated for those of you who know who David Letterman is or was. Essentially, what are those reasons? Well, the first one, the common myth of a reason for not responding to an employee survey is that there's low engagement to begin with. That's really one of the, basically a myth. It's not true. And the poor engagement is one of the least worries that we have in terms of people asking for a survey, because a lot of people who are poorly engaged want to express their frustrations in that type of a form. Poor accessibility can be an issue, especially in multi-location organizations, especially in organizations where people don't have access to a computer. Communications or poor communications can be an issue in terms of not responding. Confidentiality concerns I just mentioned, but the number one reason why people do not respond to an engagement survey is because they said there's no action that was taken since the last survey. Bar none. The other 4 don't even come close. This is the single most important reason why you may have trouble with your participation response rates, or even convincing people that you need to do a survey in the first place, is that at some point in the past, and people have long memories as well, that they're going to say, oh, well, we did a survey 3 years ago, 4 years ago. I've even heard we did a survey 10 years ago and 15 years ago, and they haven't done anything with it, so why should I answer this one? That is the single most important barrier that we're going to have to address. More important than the confidentiality, more important than the other 3 things that we're talking about there. And of course, action on the previous survey, essentially on the upside. Of course, when we get to the point where we need to get buy-in for the next survey, if we haven't done anything, then the first thing that I counsel our clients is, well, if you haven't done anything, then don't measure and do something. Put it off, measure, if the survey was done relatively recently, 2-3 years maybe, but beyond that, then we probably need to start fresh. But, even if it's a couple of months, take the time, gather the information in terms of what was accomplished after the last survey, how did it inform management decision making, and get that communication out there. Tell people how the last survey informed decisions, because in many, many cases, a lot of decisions have been informed by a previous survey that nobody's ever said anything about. But this particular slide really shows the difference, not only in response rates, but it shows the difference. Here, we ask when we do a survey again, within a reasonable time frame with the same client, what we're going to ask is we're going to ask this particular question. I've noticed some encouraging developments since the last employee engagement survey. For this particular client, only about half said that they did. 29% neither agreed nor disagreed, they didn't know, and fully 17% disagreed. What's really interesting about this is amongst this 53% who did notice some developments, their engagement level was 84. 84. The others, this 47%, their engagement level was almost half that. So it not only does acting on the survey, and I think I'm preaching to the converted here, but not only does acting on the survey set you up well for the next survey, it also is the biggest way or the best way for that, you know, to essentially to improve engagement. That's the key. That's the way. So now it becomes, okay, well, it's sort of, we're looking in the rearview mirror. So if we're at a stage where we want to do another survey, but we realize, hey, we haven't really done anything with the last one, and it is relatively recent, we're sort of in a pickle, because now it's not like we can go back and start again. So in that particular case, what I reiterate, what needs to happen essentially is we need to, you know, either hold off and do something that's concrete, and then preach what we practice, essentially communicate that. It's not only important to do it, it's more important to communicate that we do it, get that message out there. But more importantly, it's as we're thinking about the survey going in, this is when we already need to start thinking about the next one. So how then do we make sure that we take action, and how then do we convince employees that we're going to take action? Because fundamentally, it's a promise. And employees are going to take us on that promise, or they're going to reject us on that promise. So the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure, and you need to brief your leaders on this, that the accountability for engagement, the best practice here, those that get the high response rates and have the high levels of engagement, and this comes right out of a case study for one of our clients recently, the accountability for engagement has to be owned by leadership team. It's not an HR issue. It has to go beyond that. So the promise is not coming from HR. The promise has to be coming from leadership, and that promise has to be expressed overtly in advance through whatever communication channels are most important. The next thing is we need to publicly recognize those improvements in engagement. So whether we're looking in the past and we're saying, okay, well, what have we done? We need to publicly say and recognize what happened and give that recognition. The other two are really the key here. Before the survey starts, this is the way we can get people to believe the promise. We hand an ownership to and we involve employees, not just at the process, at the questionnaire stage. As we're thinking about doing this, we form that employee engagement working group. And that employee engagement working group should be consistent of about 10 to 12 employees from across the organization. Of course, we can deal with some of these objections there, but at the same time, we hand the ownership not only of the survey process, but more importantly, the action planning process to follow. So if we've got accountability owned by the leadership team, ownership of the survey process in the hands of employees or an employee working group, then we can lay out the action planning process before the survey is deployed. So in the communications of the upcoming survey, assuming that we've addressed the other hurdles that we've been talking about, in the action planning process, we basically lay out, okay, survey is going to be, conducted between this date and this date, and we're going to have the results on that date, and it doesn't stop there. What we need to tell employees before they launch or before you launch the survey is what's going to happen. So after the survey results are received, senior leadership will get briefed. They'll brief essentially their middle management teams. Employees will be briefed on such and such a date. Then the action planning process will take place as follows. So the working group will lead a number of individual working groups to conduct focus groups to explore more detail. We'll hold the workshop on this date. That has to be expressed before, so when people can see that critical path, they'll say, hey, they're really serious about this. Something's going to happen. And when they make that conclusion, you've got it. Basically, they've said, okay, we can answer this, we can have an impact, we can influence, we can do the survey because somebody's going to do something with it. I've saved the best one here for last. So you might have thought here convincing the CEO is part of that whole piece in terms of the business case at the beginning. Well, you know what? Part of it's true. To convince the CEO, you need to do an engagement survey in your organization, of course, especially if it's the first time, but not exclusively. Yes, the business case, it starts with the business case, but the business case is really, the business case is really about the left brain. So once we get that rational piece, and once they're convinced of the rational piece, then basically we've only started with the beginning. So what the real obstacle here isn't the business case. I think fundamentally, rationally, any CEO worth their salt, any leader who has any modicum of leadership training, experience, or education will know instinctively that engagement is good for business. Instinctively, they know that already. You can show them the data. You're only preaching to the converted on the left side of the brain. The real obstacles are coming from the other side, the emotive side. So what's going on in leaders' brains, essentially, how are they looking at an engagement survey the first time? And what they're doing is they're asking themselves questions like you see on the screen. What if the results are bad? What if they don't like me? What if they don't like the leadership team? And I don't mean personally, I mean more respect than like in this case. Will we be able to marshal the resources to improve? How that's going to be? And the one that I hear the most often, how am I going to look in front of the board? What's my reputation? What's going to happen to my reputation when these survey results? The engagement survey, we have to understand that any leadership team, any CEO that wants to do this is taking a risk, and we need to understand that and empathize that they are taking a risk. And the risk is not that businesses, that they're not going to get their money's worth. We've already seen that from the business case, they're going to get their money's worth if they act and improve. The risk is on these things. It's on, what if stuff goes bad? And the engagement survey is your quintessential Pandora's box. It's once we open that box, once we open the forum to employee opinion, and people say what they think, and we have it in, no uncertain, anonymous, brash terms, we can't get it back in. Those issues are now on the table. And so we have to understand that risk going in. So then how do we do that? It comes back to addressing the fears. Of course, the business case I appeal. We have to appeal to that emotional side. And the first thing is appealing to the emotional quotient. So an engagement survey is going to allow us to deal with the issues beneath the surface. The fact that it's coming out is actually a good thing, because before that it's rumor, hearsay, and innuendo that you're talking about. It's all, we reinforce, yes, we don't know what the results are going to be. We have a feeling that what the results are going to be, but it's always the first step to an improvement. And the last point here, I think very few, the first two I think are intuitive, and everybody understands these. But the one that I get the most surprise on is the last one, allowing the silent majority to speak. In an organization, any organization, the default conversation is the frustration of the day. And of course, in the halls, in the corridors, in the office, what are we talking about with our colleagues? Whether it's problem solving in a constructive sense or it's gossip and hearsay, what we're talking about is what's going wrong. So when you amplify that, one's experience in the organization over time is we tend to focus on the negative. As managers, we're problem solvers. So we discard or we discount or we choose to, ignore the stuff that's good because we need to focus our efforts on the problems. So we then get a view of the organization that it's inherently focused on the negative. And what an employee engagement survey does, a well-crafted one at least, it allows the silent majority to speak, because we're asking about fundamental attitudes and feelings that where employees are very good at discerning between the frustration of the day and the things that make us proud and optimistic and committed and emotionally invested in our organization. So yes, we might have communications issues, and yes, there might be silos in the organization, but we're doing good. If we're in the public sector, we're seeing our impact. If we're in the private sector, we can see the strength of our brand, and we can see how we're moving forward. And those are the things that engage. So when you do the employee engagement survey, this is one thing that you can tell your CEO. It's the silent majority. And you know what the reaction is? The most common reaction that I get, no matter how bad the results are, and I do get some, I get some doozies, I get some real dysfunctional places, but in each and every case, the CEO comes to me after the leadership presentation and he says, you know what, I'm surprised, they're not as bad as I thought. Even in those really bad places, they're not as bad as I thought, because they were thinking, of course, there's a fear of the worst, but they're also exposed to all that negativity, you know, the problem of the day type of thing, and then when the silent majority speaks, it's actually better than they thought. And of course, that's the beginning of improvement, and of course, that's the reinforcement of what's going well in the organization. The biggest emotion for any CEO after doing one of this, and I can tell you because I meet several of them in every week, is relief. So we need to understand that fear, that risk, and it's not just about the business case. It's about much more than that. So on that note, I'm going to hand it back to you, Louis, and you can walk folks through some of the places that you'll be able to catch us, whether it's online or in different conferences. We're very active on the learning circuit. And then we'll, as Louis is doing that, folks, I'd invite you to use your questions box. And as he's doing that, I am going to try to look at some of these questions and answer them right after that. So Louis, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Norm. Really good insight addressing some of those concerns. Some upcoming TalentMap sessions. So we are doing a series with the Conference Board of Canada, and our next event there is May 17th in Vancouver. The topic there will be employee engagement practices, drivers, and survey design. We're also going to be doing at the spring workshop for the Interior Municipal Administrators Association. That's at Nottawasaga Inn on May 11th to the 13th. Our next webinar series will be Employee Engagement Survey, Now What? Best Practices, Communicating Survey Results and Action Planning, May 26th. We'll be at the HR Executive Technology Show in Chicago on October 4th to the 7th. And we'll also be doing the People Analytics Summit in Toronto, November 1st. And lastly, Canada's Top Employer Summit Conference at Fortunes Hotel in Toronto on November 14th.
Thanks, Louis. So as I'm going through, there's a couple of really good questions. How do we handle communication to employees if the ones we survey are seasonal and their employment will end before we have a chance to implement the results of the survey? Well, assuming that those employees will be back in the next season, if they're not back, then it really is inconsequential whether or not that you convince them that we're doing another survey. So assuming they're coming back the following season, what we need to do, and we actually do this in a number of organizations, there's some agricultural-based organizations that we work with where we're dealing with seasonal workers, is we need to send out communications in terms of what happened while we were gone, what happened over the winter. You know, as part of their re-onboarding process, whatever that happens to be, and it's a good way to remind them. And of course, the communications throughout the winter, I'm assuming it's the winter months, but not necessarily, but the communication during the time that they're gone, hopefully what we want to do is we want to encourage those full-time employees, the permanent employees, to share some of those initiatives with their staff, with their seasonal staff. It's a question of communications. And hopefully, when we alert them to the types of changes and initiatives that are in place, they'll be able to try, see for themselves, talk to their colleagues, and essentially through osmosis and through onboarding or re-onboarding in this case, they'll get a handle in terms of what they do. So on that note, I don't see any more questions coming out, so I will adjourn on that note. So on behalf of Louis and myself, thank you very much. Have a great day, and you have our coordinates there if you need to reach us for any other matter. Thank you very much, and have a good day.